junkyard sprawled endlessly in every direction, a wasteland of rusted tech, crushed metal, and forgotten machines. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the piles of broken ships and discarded parts. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, the scent of abandonment. Vero, a lanky mechanic in his late 20s, was crouched in front of a half-dismantled engine, his hands covered in grime. He wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve, exhaling in frustration as he stared down at the useless pile of metal. Another day, another busted engine, he muttered under his breath. He shifted his weight and turned his gaze to the horizon. The junkyard was his second home, or maybe his first, if he were being honest. Here, among the wreckage, he'd built a life, one repair at a time, always just scraping by. If he was lucky, he could fix something, make a little extra cash. But lately, his luck had run out. And with it, his patience. Vero pushed the engine aside and stood, stretching his stiff limbs. His eyes scanned the junkyard for something worth salvaging. There were always strange odds and ends scattered around. But today, nothing seemed to call out to him. Just as he was about to turn back toward his workshop, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another pile of scrap, an illusion in the dim light. But as he squinted, he saw it, half buried under a mound of twisted metal. Something gleamed faintly, almost as if it were alive. A ship. But not just any ship. The shape was sleek, its surface sleek and metallic, with intricate designs etched into the hull. It was old, clearly, but there was an energy about it, a faint pulse of light that made his heart beat a little faster. Vero's curiosity got the better of him. He moved toward it, stepping over the wreckage and clambering past an old, burnt-out engine. As he got closer, the ship became clearer, though still obscured by debris. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its hull shimmered in the fading sunlight, almost as if it were covered in a thin layer of liquid silver. There were strange markings along its side, glowing softly in the dimming light. It had a strange aura. Something about it felt alive. Hell of a find, Vero murmured to himself. He crouched down and ran his fingers across the cold surface. The metal felt warm, almost like it had been absorbing the heat of the day. His fingers traced over the glowing symbols, and for a moment, he almost thought he could feel a faint vibration beneath his touch. "What is this thing?" he whispered. Vero stood up, brushing his hands on his pants, looking at the junkyard around him. The usual assortment of discarded ships and tech were scattered everywhere, but nothing came close to this strange, beautiful wreck. He hesitated, then stood up, walking back to his old work van. He had tools there, and maybe, just maybe, there was something worth salvaging in this strange ship. As he dug through the back of the van, gathering a set of basic tools, his thoughts raced. The ship had to be worth something, right? Even if it wasn't functional, there were parts that could be sold. Alien tech, now that was valuable. A good deal could turn his luck around. He didn't care if it had been abandoned or if there was something wrong with it. He was desperate for anything to get him out of this dead-end life. When he returned to the ship, he set to work. The wreckage was stubborn, but he was used to dealing with stubborn tech. He pried pieces of scrap away, working carefully, exposing more of the ship's sleek design. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The technology seemed older, yet there was an undeniable energy pulsing within it. It didn't take long before he realized the ship wasn't just some abandoned wreck. It was alive. There were faint hums coming from beneath the hull, subtle vibrations that felt almost like the ship was breathing. "What the hell?" Vero muttered, feeling a pang of unease mixed with excitement. He'd worked on some strange ships in the past, but this one was different. He crouched down and started working on the access panel, prying it open with a wrench. The moment he touched it, the metal shifted, almost as if it were aware of his touch. It hissed open, revealing a tangle of wires and circuitry that glowed faintly in the dim light. Vero's heart skipped a beat. He'd seen a lot of ships, but this was something else entirely. A soft noise behind him caught his attention. Vero turned, half expecting it to be a stray animal or some other junkyard dweller. Instead, he found himself face to face with the junkyard owner. Grilzar, a squat, bumpy-skinned alien with eyes that were a little too large for his face. Grilzar had been running the yard for years, selling off whatever tech people left behind, often at bargain prices. He had the reputation of being a bit of a hoarder, but if you could find what you were looking for, he'd sell it at a price that made it all worth it. Well, well, what do we have here? Grilzar grumbled, his gravelly voice a little too loud for Vero's liking. Vero tensed up, instinctively pulling his hand away from the ship. What's the deal with this thing? He asked, trying to hide his growing excitement. Where did it come from? Grilzar shrugged, his bulbous eyes narrowing. Found it in the far corner, a few weeks ago. Thought it was just another old wreck, but I didn't want to mess with it. Ships like this, they tend to have history. He gave Vero a sideways glance. History you might not want to be poking around in. Vero raised an eyebrow. History? What do you mean? Grilzar leaned in closer, lowering his voice. That ship's not just junk. It's cursed, you ask me. I've seen people try to fix it up, but no one's ever gotten it flying. It's got a bad vibe. You sure you want to mess with it? Vero's mind raced. A cursed ship? That didn't matter to him. If it had parts, he could sell them. If it was worth anything, he could fix it up. He didn't care about some old superstition. I'll take it off your hands, he said, trying to sound confident. Grilzar eyed him carefully. You sure? It's gonna cost you. Vero nodded without hesitation. Name your price. The junkyard owner scratched his head, thinking for a moment before grinning. All right, it's yours, but you've been warned. Just don't say I didn't tell you. Vero felt a thrill of excitement rush through him as Grilzar set a price. High, but not impossible. Deal, he said. And just like that, the ship was his. As Grilzar turned to leave, Vero stood there for a moment, staring at the ship. He wasn't sure what he was getting into, but one thing was clear. This ship, and whatever it held, was about to change everything. Vero stood in the middle of his cluttered workshop, surrounded by the faint hum of tools and the constant buzz of his old fan. The junkyard seemed far away now, buried under miles of dust and the weight of the strange discovery. He had dragged the ship back earlier that evening, and now it sat in the corner, hidden under a tarp, waiting for him to figure out what the hell it actually was. He couldn't get it out of his mind. That weird, pulsing energy from the ship still lingered in the back of his thoughts, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. He had spent the last few hours poking around the ship, trying to make sense of its structure, but everything about it was different from the usual salvage he worked with. The metal didn't look like anything he had ever seen, nor did the alien symbols that spiraled across its surface. It was as if the ship had been designed by someone who knew more than just engineering. They knew biology too. His curiosity gnawed at him, and by the time the sun had fully set, he couldn't wait anymore. He yanked the tarp off the ship, revealing its intricate curves and the faint light that seemed to pulse softly from within. It almost looked like it was breathing. Taking a deep breath, Vero climbed up onto a ladder, reaching for the maintenance panel that he had discovered earlier. The moment his fingers touched the panel, there was a strange, almost electric hum, and it shifted open as if the ship itself had recognized his touch. Okay, here we go, Vero muttered under his breath. His heart raced, both from excitement and a strange sense of unease. He had worked on plenty of alien tech before, but nothing like this. The ship was alive in ways he hadn't anticipated. He crawled inside the exposed panel, his hands busy connecting wires and checking readings. The interior of the ship seemed far more advanced than any tech he had encountered. Lights flickered to life inside, casting an eerie glow. As he ran his hand over the ship's systems, trying to figure out what was wrong with it, he heard a soft noise, a faint, almost musical hum. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The noise came from behind him. Vero turned sharply, eyes wide, and that's when he saw her. Standing in the doorway to the cockpit, her glowing silver skin catching the dim light, was a girl. She was tall and slender, her eyes a striking violet, large and luminous against the strange patterns that glowed across her face. Her hair, if it could even be called hair, was a shimmering mass of silken strands, flowing as though weightless, like liquid silver. Vero's first instinct was to jump back, reaching for the wrench on the counter. His throat went dry, and for a moment, he wondered if he'd hit his head harder than he thought. This couldn't be real. She couldn't be real. The girl tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like an insect under a magnifying glass. She took a slow step forward, her movements unnervingly graceful, before raising her hand, palm facing toward him. "Do not be afraid." Her voice was calm but undeniably otherworldly, almost musical. The sound of it made Vero's skin prickle. "I mean you no harm." Vero blinked. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to catch up with the situation, but nothing seemed to make sense. Who are you?" he managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl took another step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I am Zorvana." She spoke his language perfectly, though her tone had a strange, melodic cadence to it. "And this ship, it is mine." Vero's mind scrambled to put things together. "Your ship? Wait, you're saying you live here?" Zorvana nodded, stepping closer until she stood just a few feet away. "Yes. This vessel is bound to me. It has been my home for many cycles now." Vero felt his stomach lurch. "Wait, what are you talking about? This is a junkyard. I bought this ship from Grilzar. It was just sitting here, abandoned." She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and mild irritation, her gaze intense but not hostile. "This ship is not abandoned. It has merely been forgotten. I was trapped inside it." Her words hung in the air, and the weight of them made Vero's pulse quicken. "The ship malfunctioned and I could not leave. I have been here, alone." Vero blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "You're telling me you've been living in this thing?" Zorvana nodded again. Her silver skin shimmered in the light as she spoke, and Vero found himself momentarily mesmerized by the way her movements were so fluid, almost unnatural. "I was a part of a crew. My mission was to explore, but the ship, it malfunctioned. We crash-landed. The others, they are gone." Her voice softened with sadness. "I've been here, alone, for a long time." Vero shook his head in disbelief. "No way. This doesn't make any sense. Are you saying you're some kind of alien?" Zorvana tilted her head again, as if she were trying to understand the question. "I am not alien. I am of the same star cluster as many others who live on distant worlds. My species, our kind, are bound to our ships. We are not separate from them." Vero stared at her, feeling his mind spin. "Wait, are you saying that the ship is, like, alive?" She nodded, a slight movement of her head that felt more like a confirmation than an answer. "In a way, yes. The ship and I, we are connected. My life, my well-being, it is tied to it. If it does not fly, if it does not function, neither can I." Vero's thoughts raced. "So what are you saying? You can't leave? This ship is alive and you can't?" Zorvana raised a hand, cutting him off. "Correct. The systems are damaged. The ship can no longer function on its own, and I cannot leave until it is repaired." For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed her face. Her violet eyes were wide, almost pleading. "Please, you must help me. The ship needs you. I cannot survive here without it." Vero felt a pang of sympathy, though it didn't erase the nagging feeling in his gut that this was all way beyond anything he had ever dealt with. He didn't know if he could trust her. Everything about her seemed so otherworldly. Still, there was something in her voice that made him hesitate, made him wonder if she was telling the truth. "All right, fine," he said, taking a deep breath. "I'll help. But you have to explain what the hell is going on with this thing. If this ship really is as alive as you say, then I need to know how it works, why it works, if we're gonna fix it." Zorvana's face softened and she nodded slowly, almost in gratitude. Thank you. You will understand. Soon. And just like that, Viro's life was suddenly no longer his own. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had just walked into, but something told him that this alien girl and her mysterious ship would lead him into a world he could never have imagined. The next few days were a mix of frustration, confusion, and unspoken tension. Viro tried to keep his focus on the ship, on getting it fixed. But every time he turned around, there was Zorvana, her presence inescapable. It was like trying to repair a car while someone kept rearranging the parts on you. Zorvana, despite her quiet beauty, had an unsettling way about her. She was calm, collected, almost too serene in her knowledge of the ship. Every time Viro attempted to figure something out, she was there, offering suggestions in her soft, melodic voice. At first, he'd ignored her, determined to handle the repairs himself. But as the days went on, he realized that trying to fix the ship without her expertise was like trying to drive a car without knowing how to start the engine. I told you, you need to recalibrate the power couplings before you begin rerouting the energy flow, she'd say, voice cool but unwavering. Viro would grumble, glaring at the ship's systems, fingers twitching to tear it all apart just to see it work. I'm not some beginner mechanic. I can do this, he'd snap, half frustrated, half embarrassed. Just give me a minute. But every time he'd reach a roadblock and Zorvana would be there again, watching from the corner of the room like a quiet observer. It wasn't that she was incompetent. On the contrary, her knowledge of the ship's systems was otherworldly. She understood its inner workings far better than he ever could. But her presence, so calm, so sure of herself, made him feel inadequate. He didn't like it. Zorvana, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice his irritation. She was just there, always one step ahead, offering silent guidance. Finally, after nearly a week of mutual tension, Viro threw up his hands in exasperation. I need a break, he muttered, grabbing a rag to wipe his hands. I'll be outside. Zorvana watched him quietly from where she sat at the console, her violet eyes flickering with something Viro couldn't quite read. The ship is close to full functionality, she said, her voice soft. It only requires a few more adjustments. Viro paused at the door, looking back at her. I know that. But every time you tell me what to do, it just makes me feel like I'm just some tool to fix it for you. I can do this. I want to do this, Zorvana. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, Viro caught a glimpse of something more vulnerable behind her calm demeanor. I do not intend to make you feel lesser, Viro. The ship is important to me. I know how to help it, but if you are to truly assist me, you must trust me. Viro hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. There was something in her voice now, something almost apologetic, and for a second he felt a flicker of guilt. I'm sorry, she added, standing slowly. I know you want to fix it, but we need to work together. He didn't answer immediately, but something in her words struck a chord. The tension between them hadn't just been about the ship. It had been about their difference, his humanity, her, everything else. He was trying to fix things the way he knew how, and she was trying to fix things the way she knew best. Maybe they were both stubborn in their own way. Taking a deep breath, Viro nodded. All right, I'll trust you, but you have to let me try. Let me make some of the decisions too. Zorvana tilted her head, considering him for a long moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Agreed. The air in the workshop seemed to lighten, the tension easing just a little. Viro looked back at the ship, determined to fix it. This time, together. He wasn't sure how it was all going to work out, but if there was one thing he had learned by now, it was that nothing about this ship, or Zorvana, was ever going to be simple. Viro had learned to adjust to the rhythm of their work. The initial tension had eased, and though it wasn't exactly comfortable, it was productive. Each day, Zorvana guided him through the ship's complex systems, and while it was clear she was more experienced with the alien technology, Viro had begun to appreciate the challenge. The ship was a puzzle, and he had never been one to shy away from solving problems, especially when it was something as strange as this. Over the course of the week, they had made significant progress. The energy flow was finally stabilized, the engines had begun to hum again, and the internal systems, once dead, were now flashing to life with eerie precision. But something still gnawed at him. Vero couldn't shake the feeling that the ship was aware. It was more than just technology. It was as though it recognized Zorvana, like a living thing responding to her presence. He had caught her talking to it too, in a language he couldn't understand, her voice low and melodic, the words flowing in a way that felt almost symbiotic. One evening, as they worked late into the night, Vero couldn't help but ask. He'd been curious about it for days now, but the time had never seemed right, until now. "Zorvana," he said, his voice breaking through the hum of the ship's systems. "What exactly are you? I mean, you're not just a mechanic, are you? You said you've been here for a long time. Why?" Zorvana didn't turn to look at him, but he could see the slight tension in her posture. She was crouched down near one of the control panels, her fingers moving over it with an ease that made Vero feel clumsy by comparison. She took a deep breath, the air in the room thick with an unspoken weight. "I told you before," she said quietly. "I'm from a distant world. My species is bound to our ships, connected in a way that is difficult for your kind to understand." Vero crossed his arms, leaning against the workbench. "Yeah, but you've never really explained how that works. I mean, I get that you're not human, but what else? How does the ship react to you like that?" Zorvana's violet eyes shifted to meet his, and for the first time, he noticed a flicker of something ancient in them. Something that wasn't just sadness, something heavier. "The ship is not just a vessel," she began, her voice soft yet filled with an underlying force. "It is an extension of who I am. My people, we are born to the ship. We are intertwined with its systems, its life force. It is said that we are the caretakers, the keepers of our ships. It is not just technology, it is us, and we are it." Vero raised an eyebrow, a chill creeping up his spine. "You mean, you were born with it? The ship? It's part of you?" She nodded slowly, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a heavy curtain. "Yes, in a way we are one. When my ship was damaged, I could not leave. I could not survive without it. We are bound to the very energy that powers it. Without the ship, I would not be able to live." A silence stretched between them, the only sound the soft hum of the ship's internal systems. Vero's mind raced to make sense of it all. He had always known there were things beyond human understanding, things out there that couldn't be explained by the usual rules of science and reason. But hearing it from her, so calmly, so directly, it was like someone had dropped him into a whole new world. "So, if the ship dies, you die too?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Zorvana's expression was unreadable, but he could see a flicker of something beneath the surface, something deep, painful, and very old. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the control panel, running her fingers along the console. "It is not that simple," she said after a long pause. "My people do not die the way humans do. We live long cycles, many hundreds of years, but we cannot exist without our ships. The bond is permanent. When the ship was damaged, so was I. The damage was irreversible. I can only survive in its presence, as it can only survive with me." Vero felt his stomach twist. The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just stuck on this planet. She was trapped here. If the ship didn't fly again, if they didn't fix it, she would cease to exist. "Zorvana, Vero began, but the words caught in his throat. He had never considered the stakes this high. She wasn't just another stranded alien. She was connected to this ship in ways he could barely comprehend. Zorvana's head snapped up as if she'd heard something in his voice, and her eyes softened, just for a moment. "I know this is difficult for you to understand, Vero. It is a burden, but also a gift. My life is intertwined with the ship's, just as the ship is intertwined with me. But you must know, I will not let you bear this burden alone." Vero's heart pounded in his chest. The realization was hitting him all at once. He wasn't just helping someone fix a ship, he was helping an entire being survive. Everything he thought he knew about space, about life, had just been turned upside down. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but something in Zorvana's eyes, in the way she spoke, made it clear that he didn't have a choice. "I'll help you," he said, his voice stronger now. "We'll fix it together. I'm not leaving you here, not like this." Zorvana's gaze softened further, and for the first time there was something that resembled a smile on her lips. A small one, but it was enough. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice almost too soft to hear. "You are kind, Vero. You have no idea what this means to me." As the two of them turned back to the ship, Vero felt the weight of their task press down on him. The ship's engines hummed more steadily now, the lights growing brighter. The bond between them, human and alien, mechanic and traveler, was growing stronger with every turn of the wrench, every wire they connected. There was no turning back now. The days began to blur together as Vero and Zorvana worked side by side. The ship's systems were gradually coming online, though not without challenges. Every time they thought they had solved one problem, another would appear. It felt like the ship itself was testing them, as if it were as sentient as Zorvana had described. But through it all, a strange rhythm developed between them. Vero's practical, hands-on approach balanced Zorvana's intuitive knowledge of the ship, and though the silence was often thick, there was an unspoken understanding that passed between them. In the quiet moments, Vero found himself observing her more. There was something serene about the way she moved, something hauntingly beautiful in the way her silver skin caught the light. At first, it had been her alien nature that had kept him at a distance. Her appearance was so otherworldly. But now, it was the quiet intensity in her eyes, the weight of her past, that made him hesitant. Zorvana never talked much about her history, only revealing fragments when Vero pushed. She would mention her people, her kind, the Virillian, in passing, but only when she had no other choice. Every now and then she would mutter something in her own language, her voice low and distant, as if the words were ancient, full of memories that didn't belong in this world. One evening, as the stars twinkled faintly in the sky above the junkyard, Vero leaned against the hull of the ship, wiping sweat from his brow. The cooling systems had been a mess to rewire, and he was starting to feel the strain. It had been a long day, and there was still so much to do. Zorvana, standing beside him, tilted her head as she studied the night sky. The purple glow of her eyes reflected the dim starlight, and for a moment she looked almost otherworldly, more like a figment of his imagination than a real person. "Do you ever miss it?" Vero asked, half unsure why he was even asking. "Your home, I mean. Your people." Zorvana didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the stars, as though searching for something. "I miss the stars," she said softly, her voice tinged with a longing Vero had never heard before. "Not this sky, the one I was born under, the one where my people live." Vero frowned. "You've been here. How long? Years?" "Longer." Her voice was distant, her words so quiet he had to strain to hear them. "Cycles. Too many to count. I have lost track." Vero let the silence settle between them, his mind working over her words. "So, you're telling me you've been here alone for all that time?" Zorvana's gaze flicked to him, her violet eyes almost glowing in the dark. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something almost like pain before her expression hardened. "Yes," she replied simply. "Alone. The ship malfunctioned. The others, they are gone. I do not know what happened to them." Vero's chest tightened. The weight of her words settled over him like a cold, invisible hand. He had always assumed Zorvana's isolation had been temporary, like a crash landing that had gone awry. But this was something more. This was a story of loss of an entire species that had been wiped out, leaving her as the last of her kind. It was a thought that made his heart ache. He didn't know how to respond, how to say something that would make her feel better. There was nothing to say. He had never known loneliness on this scale, but he could feel it, an emptiness that surrounded her, a sense of abandonment so deep that it could swallow you whole. "I'm sorry," Vero finally said, his voice rough. Zorvana didn't reply right away. She stood silently, staring out into the distance, her expression unreadable, and for the first time, Vero realized just how fragile she truly was. He had seen her as a powerful, almost untouchable figure, someone who had knowledge far beyond his own, someone who could fix things with a mere touch. But now, he saw the cracks. He saw the centuries of solitude that had worn away at her, seen the shadows in her eyes that spoke of losses she could never heal. Zorvana shook her head slightly, almost as if trying to shake off the moment. "I will be fine," she said finally, her voice steady again, but Vero could hear the strain beneath it. "The ship will be repaired, and then I can leave." The words were like a slap. Vero's heart skipped a beat, and a strange tension filled the air between them. He had been so focused on the ship, on fixing it, that he had never really considered what would happen after. What would happen when it was fixed? Would she really just leave? He felt a knot form in his stomach, an unexpected sting of something. It wasn't just about the ship. He realized, with a sharp clarity, that he didn't want her to leave. She had become a part of his life in a way he hadn't expected. Her quiet presence, her strange and fascinating perspective on the universe, even her odd, almost hypnotic beauty. In the days they had spent together, she had shifted from a mysterious alien to something more, something real. "Zorvana, wait," Vero started, but the words caught in his throat. What was he even going to say? That he didn't want her to go? That he felt something for her? He wasn't sure. It was too complicated, too tangled up with everything else. She turned to face him fully now, her expression unreadable. "You do not need to worry about me. When the ship is fixed, I will leave this place. I will go home." The finality in her words hit him like a wave, leaving him momentarily speechless. "But," he started again, his voice more urgent this time. "What if you don't have to leave? What if you stayed here, with me, the ship?" "No," Zorvana cut him off sharply, her eyes flashing with something fierce, something he hadn't seen before. "You don't understand. I am not like you. I cannot stay in a place that is not my home. I must leave. You cannot keep me here." The sudden coldness in her voice made Vero recoil. His words died on his tongue. He had no idea what had just shifted between them, but it was like a door had slammed shut, and for the first time Vero wondered if he'd misjudged everything. Her motives, her feelings, his own. Zorvana turned away from him then, moving back, ancient, full of memories that didn't belong in this world. One evening, as the stars twinkled faintly in the sky above the junkyard, Vero leaned against the hull of the ship, wiping sweat from his brow. The cooling systems had been a mess to rewire, and he was starting to feel the strain. It had been a long day, and there was still so much to do. Zorvana, standing beside him, tilted her head as she studied the night sky. The purple glow of her eyes reflected the dim starlight, and for a moment she looked almost otherworldly, more like a figment of his imagination than a real person. "Do you ever miss it?" Vero asked, half unsure why he was even asking. "Your home, I mean. Your people." Zorvana didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the stars, as though searching for something. "I miss the stars," she said softly, her voice tinged with a longing Vero had never heard before. "Not this sky, the one I was born under, the one where my people live." Vero frowned. "You've been here. How long? Years? Longer?" Her voice was distant, her words so quiet he had to strain to hear them. "Cycles. Too many to count. I have lost track." Vero let the silence settle between them, his mind working over her words. So, you're telling me you've been here alone for all that time? Zorvana's gaze flicked to him, her violet eyes almost glowing in the dark. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something almost like pain before her expression hardened. Yes, she replied simply. Alone. The ship malfunctioned. The others, they are gone. I do not know what happened to them. Vero's chest tightened. The weight of her words settled over him like a cold, invisible hand. He had always assumed Zorvana's isolation had been temporary, like a crash landing that had gone awry. But this was something more. This was a story of loss of an entire species that had been wiped out, leaving her as the last of her kind. It was a thought that made his heart ache. He didn't know how to respond, how to say something that would make her feel better. There was nothing to say. He had never known loneliness on this scale, but he could feel it, an emptiness that surrounded her, a sense of abandonment so deep that it could swallow you whole. I'm sorry, Vero finally said, his voice rough. Zorvana didn't reply right away. She stood silently, staring out into the distance, her expression unreadable, and for the first time, Vero realized just how fragile she truly was. He had seen her as a powerful, almost untouchable figure, someone who had knowledge far beyond his own, someone who could fix things with a mere touch. But now, he saw the cracks. He saw the centuries of solitude that had worn away at her, seen the shadows in her eyes that spoke of losses she could never heal. Zorvana shook her head slightly, almost as if trying to shake off the moment. I will be fine, she said finally, her voice steady again, but Vero could hear the strain beneath it. The ship will be repaired, and then I can leave. The words were like a slap. Vero's heart skipped a beat, and a strange tension filled the air between them. He had been so focused on the ship, on fixing it, that he had never really considered what would happen after. What would happen when it was fixed? Would she really just leave? He felt a knot form in his stomach, an unexpected sting of something. It wasn't just about the ship. He realized, with a sharp clarity, that he didn't want her to leave. She had become a part of his life in a way he hadn't expected. Her quiet presence, her strange and fascinating perspective on the universe, even her odd, almost hypnotic beauty. In the days they had spent together, she had shifted from a mysterious alien to something more, something real. Zorvana, wait, Vero started, but the words caught in his throat. What was he even going to say? That he didn't want her to go, that he felt something for her. He wasn't sure. It was too complicated, too tangled up with everything else. She turned to face him fully now, her expression unreadable. You do not need to worry about me. When the ship is fixed, I will leave this place. I will go home. The finality in her words hit him like a wave, leaving him momentarily speechless. But, he started again, his voice more urgent this time. What if you don't have to leave? What if you stayed here, with me, the ship? No, Zorvana cut him off sharply, her eyes flashing with something fierce, something he hadn't seen before. You don't understand. I am not like you. I cannot stay in a place that is not my home. I must leave. You cannot keep me here. The sudden coldness in her voice made Vero recoil. His words died on his tongue. He had no idea what had just shifted between them, but it was like a door had slammed shut, and for the first time Vero wondered if he'd misjudged everything. Her motives, her feelings, his own. Zorvana turned away from him then, moving back toward the ship, her silver skin shimmering in the pale moonlight. Vero stood frozen, caught somewhere between the desire to follow her and the overwhelming confusion that clung to the air around them. The ship wasn't the only thing that needed repairing now, but how could he fix something he didn't even understand? The days following their conversation were tense. Vero couldn't stop thinking about Zorvana's words, the way she had closed herself off when he'd suggested she stay. There was an icy wall between them now, something impenetrable that hadn't been there before. She was always focused, always calm as she worked on the ship, her hands moving gracefully over the controls. But there was something different in her eyes, a distance he hadn't seen until now, and Vero couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't pretend that it didn't matter that she was planning to leave. It gnawed at him, the thought of her going, of returning to a world he would never understand. He had grown used to her quiet presence, to the strange comfort that came with working side by side, repairing this ancient ship. But now he knew that fixing it wasn't just about getting it running again. It was about losing her, losing someone who had become more than just a stranger in his life. The ship was almost ready. Vero could feel it. The engines were humming with new life, the internal systems finally functioning as they should. There was only one last thing to do, replace the core energy converter. But that, as it turned out, was no simple task. Late one evening, as the shadows grew long and the stars glittered above, Vero found himself staring at the console, his hands shaking with frustration. The last part they needed, the converter, was broken beyond repair. He had tried everything to fix it, but nothing seemed to work. They were so close, and yet, without that one crucial piece, the ship wouldn't run. And with that, Zorvana would leave. He could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest. "Zorvana," he called out, his voice echoing through the vast hull of the ship. "Come here. I need your help." She appeared from around the corner, stepping into the dim light of the control room. Her expression was unreadable, though her gaze was soft, too soft. He saw the hesitation there, just a flicker in her eyes. She wasn't ready to confront the situation either. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know you've done all you can, Vero, but the converter, I don't think it can be repaired. We're going to need a new one." Vero clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. "We can't get a new one, not without finding a way to get it off-world, and that would take weeks, maybe months. We don't have that long." Zorvana's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment she looked almost tired. "It is not about the time, Vero. It is about what comes next." Vero turned to face her, feeling the frustration boil over. "What do you mean, what comes next?" "We fix the ship and then you leave. I thought we had an agreement." Zorvana's face softened, her voice a quiet murmur. "That was before I understood how much this means to you, before I realized what this connection is." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Vero's breath caught in his throat, his heart beating harder. He wanted to ask her what she meant, to push for the answers, but somehow the question seemed too large, too overwhelming. He couldn't bring himself to voice it, not yet. Instead, he turned back to the control panel, trying to concentrate on the task at hand. "We can still fix it," he muttered under his breath. "We have to." Zorvana stepped closer, and he could feel the quiet weight of her presence beside him. "There is something you don't understand," she said, her voice low. "The ship, it doesn't just need a new converter. It needs something deeper. A piece of me." Vero's head snapped toward her, confusion written on his face. "What do you mean? What does that have to do with—" Zorvana placed her hand on the ship's console, and Vero's breath hitched as the ship's systems reacted. Lights flickered and a low hum vibrated through the air. But it wasn't just the ship. It was her. He could feel it now, the energy flowing between her and the ship, a pulse, a connection that went beyond any technology he had ever encountered. "I am not just the last of my people," she said softly, her voice trembling with something that felt like sorrow. "The ship is alive, and so am I. We are bound together in a way you cannot yet understand. But without this final piece, without what I can give it, the ship will never truly be complete, and neither will I." Vero stood frozen, the weight of her words crashing into him. "Wait, what do you mean? Are you telling me that the only way to fix this ship is if you—" Zorvana nodded, her expression a mixture of pain and resignation. "Yes, to make the ship whole again, I must merge with it. I must become one with it once more." The room seemed to spin around him. Vero stepped back, his mind racing. That's insane. You want to, what? Fuse with the ship? You'll die. Zorvana's face softened, her eyes flicking to him with an intensity he had never seen before. I will not die, Vero. Not as you understand it. I will become part of it. My consciousness, my essence will be bound to the ship's systems forever. It will give the ship the final piece it needs to function again. It will allow me to survive. The silence in the room was deafening. Vero's mind swirled with confusion, with a growing sense of helplessness. But what does that mean for you? You can't just... I have no choice. Her voice was firm, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a sadness he couldn't touch. Without this, I would cease to exist. I cannot survive in this world without my ship, Vero. I must go back, to my people, to the stars. Vero stepped forward, his heart hammering. There's got to be another way. There's always another way. Zorvana shook her head, her expression filled with finality. No, Vero. This is the only way, and it is the way that was meant to be. There was nothing more to say. Vero stood in the silence, feeling the weight of the moment. The ship was more than just metal and wires. It was a living, breathing entity, and so was Zorvana. In the end, they were both connected, bound by forces beyond Vero's understanding. He could only watch as she approached the ship's core, her body glowing faintly in the dim light. As she placed her hand on the ship's interface once more, Vero felt a surge of emotion, a strange mixture of fear, sorrow, and awe. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. Zorvana's journey and the ship's journey were no longer separate. They were intertwined, forever.